Hello, hi, I'm Jo. We've met before. Yes, hi. Yes, oh, we have two. I remembered that I knew you in a context. I couldn't remember if I had a face and a name. Yes, yes, I remember our call. Has anything come from that? Have you... Okay. Testimonials. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that at least this has come as well. It was at the start of the... Sure. Excellent. So just wondering, then, have you met
Hi.
Hi, is it Maddie?
Yes, Maddie.
Maddie, I'm Anne, and I'm chairing the session. So you are first.
Yes, okay.
Lovely. So, and then I wonder what all those.
But Yamal.
Yamal.
Yeah, but
So you're talking about your oh great, yes, so you're first.
so how do you finish 15 to 20 minutes in your question? Or?
Do you think it's best to do that, or best to do questions at the end?
Hold this one. Question here.
The one I think it's probably good to have questions related to the topic because then it moves on.
Keep to your 20-minute time, then that would be greatly appreciated. Be letting me know when there's 10 minutes to go, when there's 5, and then scary zeros. So I was just saying maybe to give us the 1. So just to minimize panic.
Nice to meet you.
I'm August. I need to download my...
Do you want to do that now?
No, I have Steve actually. I can use my Steve.
So you do that. I think we're going to do each taking questions. it's really nice to have had a chance to chat with some of you over lunch, and it's really nice to see you all today. So this particular panel is looking at using soft power in a global society. And for those of us who come from a youth and community work background, we're often being told that we take the soft approach, but any of you who'd like to come to a youth club anytime and sit in with me in an evening session, or go out onto the streets and work with me with some of the groups in the streets in North Tyneside, then you might have a different view of what soft means, because yes, it is about being involved in relationships, developing trust, developing diplomacy with people and communities, but it's a really strong commitment to the professional discipline that we're engaging with. So nobody says soft is easy. So using soft power in global society, we'll be hearing from 3 speakers. Made, who's going to go first, he's from Indonesia and he's studying for his MSc in sociology at the University of Bristol. Then we have August, who's with us from Turkey, and he's studying for an LLM in public international law. You're very welcome, August. And then we have Yamal, who's with us from Mauritius, and he's studying for an MSc in higher education at the University of Oxford. So we'll take each of the sessions, and then each of the speakers will speak for 20 minutes, and then we're going to take the questions at the end. Okay? So, Yamal.
Madi.
Oh, sorry, Madi. Sorry.
Okay.
We'll listen to yours first. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Okay, as you mentioned, my name is Madi. I'm currently completing my master's in sociology. I'd like to focus on the sociology of religion, so that somewhat will tell you why I choose faith-based diplomacy or religious-based diplomacy in the post-secular world. Now, the hard part being slotted into this time slot, it's like, after lunch, people usually feel sleepy, after having these wonderful sandwiches, and I hope I wouldn't bore you with my talk about faith.
Excuse me, Maddie, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can you put the microphone on, please? Just to ensure that everyone can hear you, to remind all the speakers that we're live streaming this room.
Okay.
Yes. They can only hear you if you wear the mic.
Okay.
So you just clip this onto your...
Don't worry, Maddie, I've stopped the clock, so it's going to after 20 minutes.
Okay.
Just wear that on your belt.
Okay, I'll just slide it in. Okay, so is that okay?
That's fine, thank you.
Okay, so I have to start all over again.
Where you left off.
Okay, yeah, okay, so my paper this afternoon is faith-based diplomacy in a post-secular world, which I think is very important, yeah. But before I start, I would like to give you the structure of my talk. But first, I would introduce you to insights that are given by some social scientists, if you will. One social scientist and one former prime minister, whose insight has actually shaped the way we look at religion in the global affairs. And then we look at the time marker in our history, how the global resurgence of religion actually affects our life. And there are some time marker when it actually happens and the outcome of that. As I mentioned before, this is a working paper. It's not a finished one. And I would like to have a lively discussion, like what Professor Ray Hodson has given in his remark, that we would need to share our ideas generously, contribute energetically to make a lasting connection with each other during this wonderful workshop. Now, as I mentioned earlier by Professor David Held on the gridlock of global cooperation, we have seen some of the possible problems, if you will, why such cooperation hasn't achieved what it's purported to achieve. And one of the things that he mentioned is that there's fragmentation of the diversity that we live in this world. And it could be a lot of different things, like political beliefs and religion as well. Now, before I move on, I would like you to ask a little bit about how many of you have read about Samuel Huntington's Clashes of Civilization? Okay, so this book has been, some of us would think that's overrated. Some think this book has been underrated. But either way you look at that, this book has an influence on how we look at religion in today's global affairs. When I look at the Handbook of Diplomacy, I couldn't find religion or faith-based diplomacy in that handbook. And I was a bit puzzled as to why it's not included. We have cultural diplomacy, we have soft power diplomacy, but it's not listed as in the Oxford Handbook of Diplomacy. And I also found out that my presentation is slotted under softer approach. As Anne mentioned, that it underlines the fact that probably religion could be deployed to build trust, to harness its values to ensure stability in the world. Now, when we move back to Samuel Huntington, in the book Clashes of Civilization, what he wanted to say was, in the post-Cold War era, the fight would be very likely between the West, democratic society, against the radical Islam, and then this conflict will replace what conflict we had during the Cold War, and it's very dangerous as to the stability and security of the world. But then it didn't happen. It didn't happen for various reasons. I believe that Huntington must have missed a couple of things, as people say. I couldn't say that he's a professor from Harvard, so I'm in no position to say that. But there are a couple of critics leveled on Huntington's. First is that he missed the fact that there are various brands of political Islam. You cannot have it one Muslim state en masse against the whole West, democratic West, because when we talk about Muslim states, there are states which are moderate and less moderate. That's the first criticism level against him. The second one is atrocities that has been perpetrated across the globe, from Bali, Istanbul, London, Madrid. They were carried out not by a state or a group of states that represent a country, but by a particular terrorist group. So they don't belong to a particular country. All the United States, before they invaded Iraq, they tried to link this 9/11 into, that it was actually Iraq was behind it. And then they went into war under the pretext that they would be able to find a weapon of mass destruction. But instead, they couldn't find it. So what they found was weapon of mass distraction. It's actually distracting people's attention to what the further truth is. And the third one is the idea of civilization that has this very given sort of limit between geographically. It's impossible. Because if we talk about Western civilization, what is Western civilization? Civilization has been a result of influencing each other. If you look at Western civilization, it takes something from the Arab world. It takes something from the Chinese civilization. So to say that Western civilization is a civilization, and then it would have or will pick a fight against other civilization is a misconception. So that's the third misconception that he purported in his book. Now, why do you think this book has still popular if you talk about religion in global scale? Because some of the group has actually internalizing that there will be a fight between democratic West and undemocratic, say, East and Muslim states. And they would think that way. If a professor from Harvard said that, so be it. So it's possible to happen because it has been predicted. So this is what happened, I believe, in Indonesia, where some of the fundamentalist group exploited what he has said in the book and under the pretext that it's possible to have that conflict, and said, okay, so that's fine then. We will have the conflict because it has been predicted. So that explains the longevity of his argument. Now, the person that also Okay. So I more support his idea about the role of religion in global affairs. Tony Blair has been a force who always maintains that it is important to understand religion in this world, because if we look at the 20th century is the struggle between ideologies. And we have two great wars coming out of that from Europe, like Professor Held has just said. And that's the struggle for ideology. But 21st century will be more likely a struggle between religion, which is equally dangerous. So understanding religion is very important. And I believe that he also has a foundation who's dealt with how religion is taught in schools. And recently he made a comment on how important is religious teachings in schools to be able to overcome some of the problems that we have, because that would impinges on how this younger generation actually live in the future. So the teaching of religions in schools is very important. And his idea was supported by some UN envoys. That is, we need to look at how we teach religion in schools. So when someone of his stature said that, we know that there's some truth in it, that religion is an important element in everybody's life, and it informs them on how people are making decisions. I believe that my colleague Yamal will talk more about how education in general would help to shape our future generation. Now, Blair then encapsulates the rise of religion on the global stage, or what we call the resurgence of religion. To our surprise, we would always think that modernization and development would lead into secularization. That even Marx, Freud, and Talcott Parsons, if you are familiar with these names, think that industrial society will be the graveyard of religious faith. So once you approach the modernity, people no longer think about religion. Or even if you approach modernity as a different level of, postmodernity as a second level of modernity, then we don't need religion anymore. And it is known as the Secularization Thesis, the significance diminishing of religious concern in everyday life, when the sacred become socially or politically marginalized, when it's withdrawn into the private rather than the public matter. So, but it doesn't happen. If we look at what's happening today, people have become more religious in one way or another. So that's why I use the word post-secular word. If you look at a British society, the Muslim families are more devout in the sense that they want to be different from their parents. They now wear hijab, where the parents don't wear hijabs. Not, well, some of the reasons that, next generation, the following generation always wants to be different from the previous generation. So that's how they distinct themselves. So I'm more religious now, different from my parents who probably are not religious. So it doesn't happen. Secularism doesn't actually happen. But as we progress to become more secular, and then religion has taken center stage, there are many surprising events that actually mark that. The first one, I suppose, is by 1971, there was this revolution in Iran, in which the power of the civilian government was taken by the religious leaders. In 1971, the CIA, which, like, I presume they would work like 24/7, sort of controlling the world and looking at the latest development in the world. But how did they miss that? They're surprised when it happens, and it end up in a hostage taking. So this is the moment when religion has become a factor in a global society. So after that, there are a lot of other things. And also 9/11. We all live by the time marker, the post-9/11 world, the post-secular world, where religion has become more prominent. You cannot imagine that before, that a couple of men who were trained to fly an aeroplane but never learn how to land the airplane. And instead of landing it on an airport, they just hit these two twin towers. So this kind of a marker makes us think that religion actually probably we need to not take it more seriously, but it is a factor in the global affairs. But why hasn't there been deployed more forcefully? Why has religion been under-acknowledged in diplomacy? There's a theory that realpolitik is the key, that if you are familiar with theory of international relation, realism is the key of it. So you have to use that to control the world, because every country has their own interest, and the only way to enforce it is by using power. And the second opinion is that there is a secularist bias, and we always think that religion is very private, individual, and irrational. So why we would use it in international relation? Although actually religion has something to offer. We can first use spiritual principles or resources, or the second one, using spiritual authority. Like in the social life of religion, we learn about charisma, how someone with posture and knowledge could actually influence the outcome of negotiation. So first using the values or principles in religion, and the second one is using the characters of people who are actually believed as religious leaders. In one of the books written by Johnston, he lined up some of the successful deployment of religion, if you will, in the faith-based reconciliation movement in Kashmir, using Sufism and Bhakti, Muslim and Hindu, Buddhism in Sri Lanka, using the monk as the conduit of reconciliation, like I've mentioned, using the spiritual authority, using their own power to influence people, to sit and negotiate and achieve the world peace. Judaism and peace building in the Middle East, because Judaism has some values like forgiveness, humility, patience, mercy, that might be deployed or used in ensuring world stability. Christianity in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. The Church of the Catholic Church has been very influential in some of the peace building in the world. And then conflict resolution as a normative value in Islamic law. We know the term Islah in my language, which is like reconciliation, bringing people to the table to talk and to resolve the problem. Okay, but then before I end my discussion, when I said religion is important, a couple of days ago this happens. Pope Francis, in the celebration in Armenia, said things about genocide in Armenia that's perpetrated by the Turkish. And the Turkish didn't take it like it. They didn't like it. They summoned the envoy, and I think they withdrew their envoys from Vatican, which shows that, okay, religion could have something, but then if you don't know how to use it, it could backfire. And it's like, I was a bit worried about this kind of development when I wrote that one, and I said, what about this? So, yeah, but then, well, so we live in a social world which is not, everything is like, you have to keep your toes on everything and watch every single development. To wrap up, I think religion could have a potential in the diplomatic arena, although it could be used alongside the traditional method of diplomacy, but leveraging religion, informing the decision maker about the religion as a powerful symbol or element or social forces in society would have a more favorable outcome. And the 9/11 invites us to examine the function of religion, which is a powerful force in the lives of many communities. And we have to think that religion is a force for good in society. It could be a site of conflict, but it has the potential as a site for reconciliation. And with that, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you, Mahdi.
Okay, thank you.
Also, August, would you like to finish your presentation?
Yeah.
And we'll take questions.
Yeah, okay.
This is after presentations.
Okay. What we might do then, can we swap speeches around and we can sort out your laptop and let the other person speak? Okay. A bit of a rearrangement to the schedule. We need to sort out the presentation on our laptop. We can ask our third speaker to perhaps speak now.
Just harness it to your belt and then just clip it on.
Oh, okay.
To your belt. Okay.
Oh, actually.
And then this. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yep. Yes, very good, very good. So thanks to Guz, I will not be stepping between you and coffee, so I think that's very good news, right? The first speaker started right after lunch. You tended to be sleepy, so I guess I've got the hardest task here, right? You're fully awake now. Okay, so my name is Yamal. Thank you so much, Anne, for this introduction. And I'm going to be talking about soft power and higher education, or at least one specific take on that. And this does not pertain to my dissertation, so it's really an area that tweaks my interest, and hopefully will bounce some ideas together here. So, and it draws in a lot of what I've been hearing from my colleagues, from different, from the sense of identity, from acting as a community, soft power being all over the place, and specifically from what Professor Held said this morning in terms of globalization, etc. So, funky title, as they say, buzzwords from the social scientists, right? Okay, it works. Yeah. Okay, so in a nutshell, what is the aim and what's the topic of this piece of research? We've been talking about globalization and how the power dynamics sometimes are in the favor of the Anglo-Saxon and Western side dominated. Can we flip that around? Can we harness globalization but inverted? And what is the role that smaller developing nations can play in that? It would be interesting to say. So this is a take on it, as I said. The aim is, I'm from Mauritius, and I'm going to be talking about the case of Mauritius and how we can utilize that. So how can we explore the development of a regional education hub, which is within Vision 2025 right now for the Republic of Mauritius? And side note, does everyone know where Mauritius is? I don't actually have a map here. It's a small, tiny island off the coast of southern Africa, close to Madagascar. Madagascar, unfortunately, is much more popular given the movie, but we're in the tropics as well. So how can Mauritius, which tries to be a regional education hub, leverage soft power in implementing this whole Vision 2025, specifically looking at the international activities, internationalization activities of higher education institutions, be it public or private. But throughout this piece of research, we're going to realize that mainly private higher education institutions have been acting up on internationalization in Mauritius. And what's the problem? Is there a problem? As we've heard from this morning, I think a lot of times this global hegemony is coming from the Western side. And increasingly right now, as you're looking at new waves in terms of development within higher education, you're starting to see the East Asian tigers, certain other in the Middle East, so UAE, Qatar, starting education hubs, utilizing knowledge as a pillar for economic development. So, are we aware of the type of reproduction that's happening? What is our awareness level? Are we, as a blanket method, just replicating a lot of that because it comes out of discourses in literature? Or are we aware of that? And how are we perpetrating the changes that we want to see? So this is early stage research. So what we're going to do here is three things. First, we're going to go through a bit of literature, initially higher education, and then we're going to connect that to soft power. And we're going to look at a bit the national context in Mauritius, because I'm sure you all know of Mauritius, but we are going to go a bit more into details. And then finally, some sort of methodology. How can we attack this piece of research? So, literature. Okay, so we're going to be talking a lot about convergence, I think, here, in terms of globalization, etc. When we're looking at what effect globalization has on the higher education sphere, we see that we are moving. There are numerous authors, and I've written just some of them here, that have been looking at the whole concept of mass higher education and how that's infiltrating different countries, and are we actually being dependent on where the knowledge production is coming out of, which is the US and a lot of Europe, etc. So this is a bit the format that we're going to follow. Altbach, who's written extensively about internationalization, and many of you may have come across him, says that oftentimes they are confused with each other. But in this whole series of buzzwords, I think we realize that globalization is acting upon higher education to lead more to a mass and then universal system of education. Tro in the US talks a lot about that as well. And there is increasingly a lot with the complexity of the world. There is a movement towards the knowledge-based economy and how services and more knowledge can be leveraged in terms of getting ahead. So I think some of these PowerPoints will be circulated probably, so you can go through in detail. So I'm just going to highlight certain things. So it's even, we've talked about trade and the importance of trade for the economic development and its role in higher education. You see that so much so that even the WTO, the GATS framework, and Knight, a Canadian author, has talked a lot about that, has talked about how cross-border supply, consumption abroad, commercial presence are elements of that framework for higher education. So along with this, we see convergence. Either we are fitting to the stereotype of the American type model of higher education, or we are becoming misfits out of that. But is that going to necessarily perpetuate itself? What about small island states? What about small nation states? Can we actually go against that? Can we flip that around? Because as we mentioned this morning, and Professor Hell did that, if you're not being able to sort out complexity, let's invent a new model. Let's come up with a new wave. But what, if we continue doing that, aren't we sort of really emphasizing, let's come up anew rather than fixing? And are we actually talking about innovation, which is totally new, rather than incremental innovation, adding to what the frameworks are already out there? And I think there is a case for that, right? So increasingly, the first wave was a lot of mass higher education. The second wave led to a lot of partnerships and exchanges between developing countries and developed countries. And the third wave of reform, as Knight calls it, is the education hub. Education hub can be city level, by state, or by types. And types is an interesting type. It's an interesting framework because it tells you, put some strategy in the way you're going about it. Are you actually vying for a student hub? Are you actually vying for a talent hub or a knowledge hub? And so student, Malaysia is focusing a lot on that and moving in terms of talent hub. Qatar exemplifies the talent type hub, and Singapore actually perpetrates the knowledge hub. So different types of models. And with the international hubs that are coming along, it's a big voice back from some of the East Asian tigers and some strategic, and we've talked about strategic in language and identity, a strategic move by certain countries to say, rather than going for a new framework, I'm going to utilize what's already out there and use it to my advantage within a vision of national agenda. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? So Convergence, so many authors have talked about it. Usually it's given the tinge of neocolonization, as we've seen since this morning. But at the same time, overall, we all agree that it is, maybe it implies, it's implicit that there is some sort of form of marginalization there, whether neocolonization or not. So can we benefit from that? And obviously, different authors, what they've written, I thought those snippets are quite interesting. Altbach, in 1987, came up with the Center Periphery platform in higher education, talking about how knowledge production initiates from the West and is actually transported into the others. But what the Asian Tigers have done is, can we develop centers in those peripheries? So let's use this model and work out something around that. And Singapore, Malaysia have been quite successful doing that till now. So it's, so that I think resumes a lot of the literature around the higher education component. Soft power, Nye, in 1990s, has framed this, and I think you can all read that. Very close to Edward Carr's Power of Opinion, Luke's Third Dimension of Power. But the first time I read this, I thought about influence. But it's interesting what Nye tells us in 2005, when looking at a new paper, is it's not merely influence, but attraction. And we all here, probably in the audience, are familiar to the laws of attraction, right? So it's, how can American higher education is already a transport of that US soft power. Can we merge the two? And we've done it, right? We've done it in the past. You've had Yang, Yasushi, and McConnell that are talking about winning hearts and minds through the transport of higher education and soft power. And you can also see that the new kid on the block, the world-class university, the world-class framework is again an exemplification of that soft power. And I think it's quite interesting that there have been cases like that. Obviously, you have the Chevening that we're all part of, which is a big exemplification of soft power. Coombs wrote a lot about diplomacy and came up with elements about soft power, even in 1964. Fulbright, Rhodes, etc. But even Cuba, perpetrating a bit the socialist and the communist type regime and the USSR, we see a lot of exchanges that have happened. Amazing to see how the sheer number of exchanges that have taken place with that. Nye, in 2004, page 7 and 8, talks about mapping, Nye came up with the whole framework. This part about translation in higher education was added by Lowe in 2011, and quite nicely so. When you're looking at coercion, one part of hard power, all the way to attraction and setting. The attraction, actually. Agenda setting, attraction, Mac to Windows. It got slightly distorted. But role differentiation equating to more hard power, and world-class university, and the whole phenomenon of that being more the soft power and perpetration of that. So, coming to Mauritius, the Vision 2025 is about attracting 100,000 foreign students to Mauritius. And we want to play a big role on mainland Africa as well, attracting a lot of the African students, because you've got a ready-made connection there. We're part of the African Union, COMESA, SADC, easy mobility of students, preferential arrangements. So how can we utilize this as a small island nation? We don't have the resources that Singapore does. So my contention is that by not building public and private partnership, but rather by diplomacy through soft power meeting public and private higher institutions, we can lead to a changing criteria. It's no longer the mightiest and the finance that's going to determine what power is, but rather, do you have some sense of identity or some criteria that is very quality-oriented within higher education that can allow you to develop those relationships. And Mauritius has been a case in Africa of a lot of a peaceful nation where multi-ethnicities have come together. Can we deconstruct that and utilize it to be able to go on African turf and develop relationships and networks that are going to help us then eventually to face out to the American universities or the top-tier universities to set up in Mauritius. Why? We have the networks that you don't have. You have the knowledge production, but we have the networks, and we can gain access into that. So what are potential research questions? Higher education institutions, through the conduct of their activities, leverage power, not in a selfless type manner, perpetrating their internationalization activities, but within Vision 2025. So you get nationhood and private interest merging. And the criteria for that is not the amount of money that I have to go recruit students anymore in Africa, but rather, do I have quality-oriented indicators that I want to develop a priority area of the sector of the national economy? So I want to focus on ocean strategy. Can I develop some sort of agreement through the diplomacy angle for both of us to go together on African turf and recruit students? And obviously that buys you credibility at the same time. So these are, the first one appeals more to higher education institutions. The second one appeals more to the government as a governance tool. How can they play a role in that? And eventually, can that over time build a sense of identity, a communal identity? I've whisked through the last part. I'm clearly aware of that. But methodology, how can we look at that? Because of the lack of statistics within many different African countries, including Mauritius, early starts, right? You cannot get hard data to be able to build a case for that. So what this proposed research takes into consideration is, can we do an inductive? Can we do a sort of a constructionist type framework? And through interviews and discussion and dialogue, which was taken up this morning even by Professor Held, can we actually get like-minded parties to work out a framework of how do we go on African turf? How do we conduct that? How do you research it? 3 different ways. First, documentary evidence, and obviously a lot of literature around education hubs, more of a buzzword, has to do with great literature, policies, plans, vision statements of governments that keep getting updated every 5 years because they don't reach those numbers. And many of them have been numbers focused. Mauritius had 100,000 foreign students in 2015. Next time I checked, 100,000 foreign students in 2025. Very good. At least we're adding some dose of honesty to that, right? So how do we conduct that research? Documentary evidence from what we have, and purposeful quota sampling, just because you need to go where the voices are actually going to help you determine that data, by collecting 5 public HEIs and 5 private HEIs that can work together from the case of Mauritius. The second one is through policy agents. So the Quality Assurance Agency, the Study Mauritius, which develops that vision and implements that vision of internationalization for the government, developing council, but more specifically, the sub-Saharan embassies and consulates. How many can we work with within different models to come up with that type of a tool, right, of how we approach? And lastly, I think it would be really interesting to get intersectoral groups together. So government with private entities to sit around the table so that you're not hearing it from only one voice angle anymore, but you're hearing that the rich brainstorming that's coming up out of that. You mix the 3 and you get some semblance of a tool to begin with. Quite short, quite fast, right? I really look forward to questions. Ethics, we all do it, right? But the only part that I'd want to emphasize, I come from the higher education system in Mauritius. So I think my voice and my bias is very important in terms of the ethics around that. And the second portion is, what if certain policy agents, eager to instill change, carry out systemic change at the country level, want their voices heard? How do you wrap with that? Because it's always about me being the ex-Minister of Tertiary Education, mentioned specifically for interviews for a different piece of research that I'm going to Mauritius in 2 weeks. I want to be named. Can I be? we'll need to work it out. But you have a lot of that, certainly because it's early start research. So a lot of voices want to be heard and recognized as being sort of immortalized to have carried out change. So thank you very much. This is just a few ideas.
Thank you, Yamal.
Thank you.
And now closer.
Yeah, good. Sure. Thank you very much. It doesn't work anyway. Thank you. Oh. I'm taking this home.